Good morning. And Julianne said, turn and say hello to Zoom. So, okay. The Center for European Studies has been coming here to ILR for quite a number of years, usually in this fall semester. It's part of their outreach program, and we've always enjoyed their programs, and I'm looking forward to this as well. When we were planning our program for this year, the theme, we decided to make it something like, now how did that all turn out? Because you know the way the news cycles work. You'll have a crisis, and for a couple weeks or a month, that's all you hear, and then something else comes up, and maybe a month later you'll hear, well, they still seem to be chugging along over there. So we'd like to go back in this series and look at some of those crises that Europe had to confront, how they worked it out, and then how things are moving along. I think Brexit would be a great example. You know, we heard about Brexit for what? For a year. Are they going to be in? Are they not going to be in? What will happen? Well, in January of 2020, it happened. And after that, we haven't heard much. And so that'll be one of the subjects we'll talk about. I want to now introduce my partner and the lady who really put this whole program together, Carla Ruffa. Now, Carla is a key member of the staff at Center for European Studies, and she works on all of the outreach mission projects that they have, whether it's grants, working in this kind of situation, and then she liaises with the faculty to put the programs on. So when Carla and I talked this spring and we decided on this as our theme, then she went to work, met with the faculty, explained what we would like to do this year, and then over the summer, one by one, people on the faculty stepped up and said, yes, we think we'd like to do this and we'd like to handle this particular subject. So today, we're going to be doing an overview of what some of those crises were in Europe, just to kind of give a feel for the atmosphere over there. I know we'll enjoy this. I'm going to now turn this over to Carla, and she'll introduce our speaker.
Thank you so much, Ron, for that. Hello. Hello to everyone. It's very nice to be here again. I see some familiar faces. It's been many years since I've been able to physically be here, so it's nice to see you, and thank you so much for having us back. Again, I'm Carla, and I'm the outreach coordinator at CES, and I'd like to introduce our speaker today. Asli Baysal joined CES as a lecturer in European Studies in fall 2019. She received her doctoral degree in summer 2019 from UF in political science, and her dissertation research focuses on democratization in the history of European integration. She's originally from Izmir, Turkey, where she received 2 bachelor's degrees in international relations and European Union and international trade and finance. And she holds 2 separate master's degrees in political science. Lots and lots of education there. She offers courses on Europe, European Union, Turkey, and comparative politics. And so I'd like to hand it over to Asli.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Oh, all right. This is very high-tech compared to my online teaching experience that I had during the pandemic. Today we are going to talk about the European crisis, but I don't know, if some of you were here, but I actually, talked about this crisis back in 2017. I designed a course in 2016 about that is called European Union in Crisis, and at that time, it kind of attracted a lot of attention, and as you said, it was because of Brexit. And here on the other side of the Atlantic, we kind of got interested in the European Union and these numerous crises that it was going through. And the interesting thing is we are still talking about some of these crises and the impacts, but they kind of changed their shape and form and impact, and they became this interesting multitude of crises that is challenging the future of European integration. And when I came back, when I came here, back in 2017, I was actually saying that the European Union is an organization that actually fails forward. So, which means that through the crisis, it actually gets strengthened, because with each crisis, it actually thinks that it was a little integration that caused it and tries to integrate even further. And when you look at the history of the EU, the European Union, which started as the European Coal and Steel Community, and then kind of accumulated these other competences, and is kind of going towards the United States of Europe for some, you kind of see that these crises often kind of made the EU stronger. We can actually start, yeah. Okay, all right, yeah, exactly. There it is, okay, perfect. All right. So this is actually the slide I was checking, my slides from that 2017 talk, and I realized, how much of my own views have changed. This was actually, the covers of the Economist magazine, and how it was kind of this, doing the scaremonger thing about the future of the Europe. Divided we fall. Can anything perk up Europe? Is this really the end? And Europe's midlife crisis, how to save Europe. It's always having this very scary picture about the future of Europe. And at that time, I was not very much worried about the future of Europe, because we kind of realized that the immediate responses that the EU actually came up with were going to make the EU much more supranational. And we are going to kind of I just want to kind of give a very brief overview and of how the EU progress. And don't think about the readings, the typings here. This is a kind of an infographic that I use for to kind of explain the chronology of events. These are all the treaties that kind of made up the EU. So it started with the Treaty of Paris as a European Coal and Steel Community. Just think about that part here. Oh, sorry, back. Okay, there you go. It started as a treaty on a Treaty of Paris of European Coal and Steel Community, and then it kind of added into it European Economic Community and European Atomic Energy Community, and they merged. And then later on, with the Single European Act in 1987, they decided to have a single market. They said we have to have not just customs union, where the tariffs and barriers and quotas are kind of induced for trade, but we should have freedom of movement of people, goods, services, and capital. That's 4 freedoms. And then the single market was going to require some changes to the decision-making mechanism, because you cannot actually make these countries to have freedom of movement of people, goods, services, and capital without actually passing a lot of legislation. It's not a very easy thing to do. So in order to kind of accelerate this, they actually made the qualified majority voting a widespread decision-making mechanism. So for many things to be able to kind of pass quickly, they introduced this so that all these nation states wouldn't induce or claim a veto right to kind of block the completion of a single market. So basically, the treaty itself is not the time when single market was reached, but single market was kind of like, projected to be reached at the end of 1992. And then we what did I do? Forward? Okay, there you go. So Single European Act is that treaty, which is the major commitment to European integration that they had. They said they want to have this common economy. And the Treaty of Maastricht in 1993, which is now called Treaty on the European Union, because they kind of like, wanted to change their name. They wanted to call it no longer European Communities or Community. They wanted to call it the EU, European Union. But it was still far from being United States of Europe. So that was going to require some more federalization attempts, some more kind of like, common identity building. So they couldn't do that. So Treaty of Maastricht basically said that we are creating a union, not just in economic sphere, but also in political spheres. And political sphere means we should have a common foreign and security policy where we actually retain our veto rights still, but we are trying to speak with a single voice in the world arena when a crisis occurs. So they wanted to have a foreign minister, for instance. EU foreign minister is currently making a lot of announcements. We call them the high representative instead of the foreign minister, but they are making common statements about what the EU agrees on with regards to Ukrainian crisis, for instance. And we have and they also said we can also cooperate in justice and home affairs, which is also something that is very intergovernmental. If you think, when I say intergovernmental, think about states would be less willing to give up their sovereignty on those matters, justice and home affairs, right? The security concerns, the flight lists, for instance, sharing data with the other police enforcement, for instance. All these things are going to be much more intergovernmental. So what happened is that they put together both intergovernmental and supranational things, economy being supranational, which means that they are mostly taking these decisions based on qualified majority voting, and an intergovernmental as well, with the justice and home affairs and common foreign and security policy, and they kind of decided to cooperate. The reason why they actually introduced these two new pillars is because they thought if they actually incorporate these policies into the EU framework, they could actually maybe later transfer it to the supranational level, because they are going to have iterated conversations and then the interactions, and that is going to build a common voice. And one of the most common practice, for instance, in common foreign and security policy, is that they use constructive abstention, it's called, where they say, if you want to make a statement about Russia, you can do it. I'm just not going to say anything. So they avoid. But it doesn't work like veto rights. So they still try to represent, they still allow these other states to have this kind of part. But of course, this Treaty of Maastricht became essential because it basically made the union a political union now, right? This brought about the questions of democratic credentials of the EU. If these are bureaucratic monsters, running things from Europe, are they really just trying to make our, people angry by measuring the curvature of bananas and things like that, because there's this a stereotype that the EU is very much controlling everything, regulating everything, and so on. But they realized that political union was going to require some empowerment of the European Parliament at the supranational level, so that it would function as the House of Representatives in the future United States of Europe, and the Council would work as the Senate representing states' interest, and then They would have a judiciary, which is the European Court of Justice, like the Supreme Court. So we actually have these tools and mimicking a federal state now. But of course, things are going to change because all this happiness that is happening in 1993 when they're signing on to this is about the end of the Cold War, liberal democracy won, everything is good, and we are going to also welcome these Central and Eastern European countries, and we are going to be this giant continent, a semi-continent actually, it's not, its continent existence is disputed as well. It's the it's a peninsula of Asia basically, but they really wanted to have their integration moving towards that United States of Europe idea. And this is also when they said, if you have a single market, you need to have a single currency. Because how are you going to make these four freedoms work if you're always going to the foreign exchange, shop and then just converting the currency, right? So they kind of came up with that idea. I'm kind of talking about this because this is going to actually make you understand all these future speakers in this series. They're going to talk about these various crises that is happening. And I wanted to kind of give you an idea how things kind of started, and I'm going to contextualize it in the crisis as well. And Treaty of Amsterdam is 1999. By that time, they know that they have 15 member states, 6 founding member states, Benelux countries, Germany, Italy, France, and then UK, Denmark, and Ireland joined in 1972, and then the Spain, Portugal, and Greece, after returning to civilian governments, applied in the 80s, and they were welcome because they didn't want them to be authoritarian again. And they accepted them. And then Austria, Finland, and Sweden joined. So by 1995, the EU has 15 member states, but they're now talking about allowing 10 new member states who were previously satellite states, and they were run by this authoritarian regimes. So they kind of wanted to make sure that the region is stable, so security concerns were involved, and that they would actually allow these countries to democratize. They incentivized them with money, and they said if you actually fulfill certain requirements such as democracy, free market economy, and others, we will actually accept you. And they negotiated for years. And at the end, Treaty of Amsterdam was basically saying this: we have to rearrange the institutions, institutional weight, because usually the number of influence, the weight of the votes of the countries depends on their population. So Poland, for instance, was 60 million people. So it was around the population of Spain. So that was kind of one is an old member state, one is a new member state. So these were kind of important matters. So they said let's reform the institutions in a way that there is a good representation of these different countries and their peoples. And they also realized, for instance, justice and home affairs is such a big pillar to actually say that it should be all intergovernmental, because they realize they are actually on the same path with the other countries. They don't ever use their veto rights. So they kind of understood that. They said, why don't we just leave intergovernmental part into police and judicial cooperation in criminal matters? These are still national sensitivity inducing matters. Why don't we just do justice and home affairs, kind of some of the matters move into the supranational pillar. So now we are seeing things, competences that were once intergovernmental, by cooperating for years, by understanding that you don't have to retain your veto right there, they kind of moved into the supranational pillar. right? So supranationalization is happening there, right? So they are kind of like, giving away more rights, more transfer of sovereignty to the EU. And later on, they got so happy because now they are having this expected members coming in 2004, and Treaty of Nice also about the institutions. And in 2004, the EU is a union of 25. And that 25 members is kind of like, creating kind of doubts about the dilemma between deepening and widening. Deepening is basically the EU assuming more roles, doing more things, undertaking more tasks. And widening is that, you get new members, the enlargement of the EU. So sometimes this issue came up. You don't want to be in the, you don't want to do something more with people that you are not familiar with, right? And that was kind of the problem. The family is getting bigger, but do you really want to kind of like, share all your life story with that, new family members? It's kind of like, similar. So they kind of like, started to have doubts about deepening and supranationalization, supranational decision-making mechanisms and transferring sovereignty over there. But it was the public who was worried. It was not the elites. Elites thought, now it's the time for a constitutional referendum. Let's have a constitutional referendum and let's make this constitutional treaty and then have this like, simplified text of all these treaties that we have done, which were very diplomatic, very bureaucratic, and then kind of like make people own that constitutional treaty. But it was neither a constitution nor a treaty. It was called constitutional treaty. Treaties are intergovernmental, right? Everyone has to say yes. And then constitutions are more about like, common people coming together and kind of like, making a projection about the future. And that constitutional treaty, which is neither a treaty nor a constitution, basically were put out for a referendum, and then the two countries, the people in two countries actually rejected it, and the referendums for the other countries, or if they have a parliamentary approval process, in those countries, it was canceled. It was French and the Dutch. So two founding members basically rejected the constitution or any future attempt at United States of Europe. And what the EU elites did was pretty interesting, because elites are the ones who actually sign on to these treaties. They want to integrate. They want more cooperation. But they're not very happy that now the people who actually didn't say anything about the EU, now they started talking about the EU. And that was kind of a problem, because now the EU was becoming something political. And that political identity of the EU politicized the people. Why? Because 1993, in the Treaty of Maastricht, they said they are going to have a single currency. People started to see the euro in their pockets. So they know that their currencies are being dismantled. They know that they're now controlled by the European Central Bank, for instance, right? So they know that they cannot print money whenever they want. They know that they can travel, and they know that there are benefits to EU membership and all the things. For instance, like European Commission does these, infomercials, like, things like, to promote themselves. They say, did you know that you had roaming fees before? Now you don't. It's because of the, things that the European Commission did. Because people don't know, what the European Union is actually doing, how it is actually enhancing. Or the water standard for, everyone, across the union. Or the regional funds that the, Welsh or the Scottish was getting, or the, other regions were getting. They don't know if it's actually coming from the EU. It's very problematic to kind of from the EU's perspective to tell these people, because they are talking to their national politicians, and national politicians are speaking their language. And so they can say whatever they want, and it's very hard for an EU official to actually make a case that I did it. And so the good things are always on the EU, and the bad good things are always on the national government, and then the bad things are always on the EU. It became the scapegoat of national governments because of the structure that we have. We have the national parliaments, national politics, and we have the European level politics separately. And what happened is an interesting thing, because that constitutional treaty, you know what they did? They just changed the symbol section of that constitutional treaty, where it talks about Ode to Joy, like Beethoven's Ode to Joy as the national song, and it's, all these symbols about European values and so on. They removed that preamble of the Constitution, and they call it Lisbon Treaty, and which is constitution through a backdoor, basically, and they passed it. Because the goal was not to have a constitution, it was to have a kind of a simplified understanding of the institutions and how they work. This was, Lisbon Treaty, for instance, was the first time they actually literally said, even though it was evolving that way, they never said it in the treaties before, they said, the EU has a bicameral legislature. The upper chamber is the Council, and the lower chamber is the European Parliament. So basically, they were laying out all these institutions as if it was a state. So they wanted to really pass that regardless of these, objections, and it passed, 4 years later, really. But they understood something there. They understood that it's no longer an elite project. It is removed from the public input. They have to convince the people to be able to integrate further, and because it's affecting people's lives. And it's people are seeing that Europe is visible. It can cross borders. Sorry, I need to. Finally, something that you can actually, see clearly. So what happened is, after this Lisbon Treaty, they kind of had to put an asterisk to anything that they are saying that they are going to do. And they also knew that it's not, going to be possible in the near future to actually integrate further, to deepen the integration, because they knew that a kind of a failed referendum is a crisis. There are too many referendum failures. For instance, Denmark, when they were introducing euro, they actually didn't pass Maastricht Treaty, and they said to Denmark, you can get an opt-out. UK already negotiated an opt-out from the Eurozone, but Denmark didn't. And it was the referendum failure that made the EU to give concession to Denmark. So Denmark doesn't have to adopt the euro. But any country that actually joins after that treaty was signed is going to eventually adopt the euro. They don't have an opt-out anymore. And the UK, for instance, if it wants to rejoin, realizing the biggest mistake that they have done, they're going to actually be in the Schengen zone, because it has to be that way. They have to be in the Eurozone. They have to actually leave pound, and they have to really go through the same processes that 10 new member states or the Central and Eastern European states went through. And it's going to be very fun to watch in the upcoming years if that happens. But what happened is, of course, we have the financial crisis in the US, and it's a global world, and we kind of had the ripple effect, and then a severe Eurozone crisis starting with 2010. And then this Eurozone crisis started to show these differences, these cleavages in the EU a little bit more. So for instance, why is it Italy and Greece and Spain having these problems with the sovereign debt? Why is it the creditor-debtor cleavage? Why is it that some countries are actually benefiting from the EU membership better, and why some countries have to be the creditor all the time, right? So they kind of like, started to understand these like, deep-seated cleavages in the EU. An old member versus new member state. That's the, other kind of like, thing. So we kind of like, see that the Mediterranean countries, the old member states are suffering, but then we kind of like, see the increase in GDP and kind of like, in the other countries, like in Poland and Hungary, although they also kind of like, had the impact of the Eurozone. So there's kind of this like jealousy between the old members and the new members as well. And then the north-south divide. So you kind of like, see that the north of Europe is like, much more like, wealthy and they have like, less problems compared to the south. And also the expectations that the EU has from these countries are not matching. So for instance, you cannot say to Greece that, just like, do the austerity policy and then do like, produce more cars and sell. They don't have the German cars, right? They have the tourism and other type of like, industries that we have, that they could have. So economies are different, right? So as a result of this Eurozone crisis, they realized one thing. We haven't integrated enough, that's why it's happening. And as a result of the Eurozone crisis, they kind of like, realized that they had the monetary union, they had the single currency, the euro, but they forgot to check the fiscal policies, the spending part. So European Central Bank is deciding on the interest rates, for instance, to fight inflation, right? And if you are actually not looking at like, how they are spending the money and the, revenues that they're having in their own national parliaments, you're going to have a problem because these countries are not going to be able to print money on their own because they don't have a central bank to fight with this problem. So they kind of like, realize that they have to have a fiscal surveillance and have to have a fiscal union now. So reckless spending, reckless borrowing from the Greek government, for instance, kind of scared the EU officials, and they said, we have to kind of do something about it. Because here's the thing. If you are putting in a family both Greece and Germany, and then Germany has a very high credit score, let's say, okay? And basically, what you are doing is to give Greece the additional card that you put, like, on those cards. Or basically, Germany is becoming a guarantor in a way. And that high credit score that Germany has makes these banks eager to lend because they know that if something happens, Germany will pay for it, right? So basically, even though Greece was not able to kind of like, had the structure to pay those debt back, they kind of like, kept borrowing and the banks actually allowed it. And this is not just banks like, international banks, it's also German banks, right? So it's kind of like, making it a crazy, like, this, like, storm of events, basically. At first, they said, Greece has to kind of like, apologize. They were faking the books and they shouldn't have, they should have been more responsible in spending. But then they realized later that they're going to have this like, problem of their banks failing because Greece is not going to be able to pay back. And whole structure was going to be challenged, just to, put it in a, short version. So they realized that they have to look at how these, like, reckless spending is happening. Greek governments, each one is coming and saying, I'm going to hire more teachers, more policemen, more something. So that kind of brings them votes, right? And they can do that by borrowing money before the elections. And that kind of like, created this spiral of events. And they kind of like, couldn't keep up with it. And the minute that the market realizes that they can actually default, they had the European leaders, despite being hesitant at first, had to step in, especially Germany. But Germany said one thing: austerity policies. If you want to actually want me to bail you out, I'm going to actually make you to have some austerity measures and cut spending. And the country is already failing economically, and you're telling them to spend less, but then you cannot actually solve a lot of the problems by spending less. You have to actually create jobs for the new people, for people who are going to produce and contribute to the economy, and then make it grow. You're just saying, be responsible, don't go out, don't spend don't eat at restaurants, just sit at home and you will be fine, right? So that was kind of the first time that Germany became this hegemonic power in the eyes of the European leaders. It was always a Franco-German integration since the beginning. It still is, but then the dominance of Germany, because of being the largest economy in the EU, they kind of became the main actors in this management, in the management of this Eurozone crisis. But overall, we kind of we're saying right before the pandemic, Greece is paid back, most of their debts, and they're actually in a better position now. And yes, they suffered. There was a lot of youth unemployment, both in Spain and Greece, and in other countries that were part of this bailout package. But they came up with this semi-fiscal union thing. They had a banking union. They had this European semester thing where they would actually look at the books of countries at the national level, how they're making the spending. They have to report certain things. And that kind of changed things. And also, don't forget, all these treaties that I told you, it had a no bailout clause. It said, defectors are going to be punished, and if you actually do not show the sound financing and everything, you're going to be punished, and there's no bailout from the other countries. It had a no bailout clause. And despite that, the market was saying, oh, Germany will save them. So basically what happened is that they wanted to create a system in which that the bailout is also, not a possibility in the future. So they failed forward. So they failed, but they actually strengthened the system because of this crisis. And they kind of had preventive measures to make sure that it's not going to reach that point again where there's going to be a need for a bailout. And the refugee crisis. In 2015, we kind of see millions of people are on the march towards Western countries, mostly Germany. And the EU response was interesting because at the beginning, right after this Eurozone crisis, when Greece and Italy were trying to trying to make a comeback, they were also the ones who faced the refugee crisis because they had a shore, right? And that was kind of creating this burden on already vulnerable countries, and the EU had to step in and have a solution EU-wide. What happens is that they do a treaty with Turkey, a candidate country since 80s. So kind of applied the 80s, candidate country since 1999, and negotiations started in 2005, but they had an association agreement back in 1965. So they were in line to get into the EU, since 60s. My country, Turkey. Yeah, it's a fun country to look at, not to be from. Let me tell you. But, all these years of trying to be a European state was kind of stopped with the fear of the Europeans that, on this refugee crisis. When they were kind of criticizing Erdogan's democratic backsliding in Turkey, and when they were criticizing Erdogan's flirting with Russia and Iran and China, and when they were kind of questioning this major NATO ally and how it was going to be kind of be a Western state, they kind of gave in to the demands of Erdogan, because Erdogan said I'm not going to stop the refugees, because it was partially Erdogan who kind of let them go. And EU basically promised is for every refugee that is returned back to Turkey, a certain kind of money. And it wasn't much, by the way. It was 6 billion euros, but, given that they have stayed, for more than 10 years now in Turkey, it kind of became a problem in Turkish economy as well. So the EU is basically bordering a country that is becoming much more undemocratic. And it's kind of having all these refugees trying to get out of Turkey to Europe. And it's kind of a problem awaiting as well. And also, not to mention that, you say we don't negotiate with the authoritarian governments, and you kind of do not accept the invites, and you kind of do this cold shoulder thing. And then all of a sudden refugees are coming in and, dear Erdogan, let me just visit you and all that. On the day that Ukraine was invaded by Russia in the recent attack, Olaf Scholz made the first foreign visit that he had as a chancellor of Germany to Turkey. And they were the social democrats who were staunchly, opposed to the idea of negotiating with an authoritarian leader, but they had to give in to the demands. So this is kind of problematic from the democratic identity of Europe, because the European Union was always saying, forget about all these old and new member state cleavages, forget about these East and West cleavages or the creditor-debtor. We are Europeans because we are democratic states. They didn't also want to kind of say European Catholic or Protestant or Judeo-Christian or Greco-Roman, all these commonness that might tie them. They said, we have an objective criteria for EU membership, which is democracy. If you're democratic, if you have free market economy, it doesn't matter if you're Albania with a majority Muslim population, you can join. It doesn't matter if you're Turkey with a majority Muslim population, and or Serbia with Orthodox population. We are going to accept you. But this kind of change of events kind of made their main identity that they defined in the Lisbon Treaty questioned. And also refugees, how they are treated in the years that we have seen scandalous pictures from the, I'm going to show you in a second, with the Hungarian journalists, kicking out a refugee and all these scandals and so on. Or European Commission President von der Leyen saying when the Greek police is showing violence against the people who are trying to seek asylum, she said Greece is protecting our external border. They have every right to do so. So kind of gave a green pass. So it's kind of making people doubt of their humanitarian, normative, and democratic identity. And Europe is very well known for this this kind of conflicting image, they're trying to be nice, but they're nice. They're not nice. They have these evil intentions and so on. So that made everyone doubt these ideas. And then Brexit Brexit was very good in a way for the EU. And it was only in the Lisbon Treaty, the exit clause was added. Before, there was no option to exit the EU. There was just like, a definition of like, who may be eligible to enter. But there was no exit clause, but David Cameron said, please add that to the treaty. We might actually want to do a referendum, because he gave into the demands of like, more conservative, like, parts in his party. And as a result, this exit clause, which was basically saying you are going to trigger Article 7, and it's going to be a 2-year timeline to exit, and you have to like trigger that Article 7 with like a kind of a clock, like a countdown timer. And it wasn't kind of like laying out all the problems that might exist, right? Since 1972, the United Kingdom was a member of the EU. 1972 means that all these things, all these competences that were once decided by the EU are no longer decided by the EU. So basically, that kind of like, changed as well. And the Ukraine crisis. Ukraine crisis has a potential to actually unite Europe. So for instance, Poland is a country that is also having rule of law problems, and the EU is criticizing it. But all of a sudden, like, with the threat of Russia, they started to kind of like, be much more cooperative. Biden visited Poland and all that. So it kind of has that impact of like, uniting. But, we will see what happens. So let me just like, kind of, okay, I'm skipping that. Let me kind of like, go through this. The idea that the Europe will be forged in crisis, and the Jean Monnet, the person who is behind this idea of supranationalism, who was a French bureaucrat, he said, like, people only accept change when they are faced with necessity, and they only recognize necessity when a crisis is upon them. So he kind of like, claimed that you have to like, have crisis to move forward. So it's kind of good, because Europe itself is born of crisis, because the Second World War was a devastation for the nation states. They had to find a way out, and that was European integration. But at the same time, you kind of like, see that it's not likely, because Germany is an essential actor. So this failing forward basically says that all these treaties that they negotiated, they kind of like negotiate on the lowest common denominator. And that lowest common denominator is actually kind of creating half-baked institutions. And that kind of like, creates institutional failures and negative spillovers. And basically you have a crisis, and then you try to fix that, and it kind of like, goes like that. That's failing forward. But then there's another thing called theories of European disintegration. How can it fall? One of which is the hegemonic stability theory. It says, in the absence of strong supranational institutions that can actually make leadership, like have leadership, you have to have a very good hegemon who is kind of forcing everyone to do things in a certain way. I kind of like, want to say that it's not the case. Germany is always a reluctant hegemon because they don't want to look like an hegemon. They have a bad history, and everyone is scared of them. I mean, you cannot believe, like, during the Eurozone crisis in Greek media, how many times, like, Merkel was put in, a Hitler mustache, like, on the covers, because there's always that element. So Germany always kind of like, gets back. And also Germany has its own interests. Nord Stream 2 with the Ukraine crisis, it was a big investment that Merkel did. Everyone was like crying that Merkel was leaving the office. They were getting nostalgic about the whole, bunch of crises that she led. But now she's not remembered very well because of the reliance on Russian gas that Merkel created. And now they're trying to step back and then solve the environmental crisis and, make sure that they, the only way out is actually being more green, which is going to take some time and money and all that. And that energy crisis is creating other problems that is going to create a lot of things. I'm just going to, show you a few pictures here. So, oops. Oh, sorry. I think it skipped. So, failing forward after Eurozone, all these new policies that they introduce. And then now we have an energy crisis and inflation, and the already vulnerable, just recovered countries after the pandemic, after the Ukraine crisis, are going to have to face the inflation issue, and that's going to cause recession, they say. And the thing is, they don't have central banks to print money. It's the European Central Bank. It kind of makes it more essential, but then at the same time, kind of takes away one of the tools that countries can fight for themselves, because countries' economies are different. And another thing is, the topic of the last year's conversation that I had here with you is the Eastern Mediterranean conflict. And not just that, also on the islands, Greece and Turkey, both run by populist governments, are at every chance, and two NATO countries are at every chance trying to get into this fight because it improves their approval rate at home. And that can actually be devastating for Europe as well. And all this energy crisis that the Ukrainian war is causing is reaching that territorial conflict as well. And then they were saying, stand with Ukraine, stop buying Russian oil. And this was from a recent protest in Germany. They got money for wars, but can't feed the poor. This is a socialist critique. But Europe is thinking, by actually supporting Ukraine, they're also supporting their principles, democracy, freedom, and all these principles. So it's not just about fighting back the Russians. It's also about their identity. They don't want instability in the region. They don't want Russia to convince the others to join. But this tug of war is going to create inequality in the economies, inflation. It's going to impact the consumers, and it's going to and the ones who are actually welcoming Ukrainians right now, I don't know if they are going to in the future, because right now they were they didn't have the same impact that they had with the Ukrainian refugees. With the Syrian refugees, they were all supportive of that. So they changed in that manner. But if they are to stay in these countries, it's going to be another burden. And immigration is already all over the world is an issue that is raised by populist parties. And then you're going to hear about, for instance, all these things that the COVID-19 responses that the EU did. They were hesitant at first, but with the hesitant first Germany and then helpful Germany, they created all these responses. But European Union lived up to its responsibilities during the pandemic. This is from a study. You see more red, let me tell you. People don't buy it. Even though the EU does something, they don't buy it. They always see it inefficient or not capable. So even though they created these responses, it didn't actually transfer to the public. All these things are actually potential EU leaving names. When the Brexit discussions were on, they said what would, my favorite is checkout for the Czech Republic exiting. That would be a good referendum name. But all these things, immediately they realized a country that has been in the EU since 1972, who actually kept it from being a United States of Europe, suffered so much, even though they were not part of the Euro, they were not part of the Schengen, and they are devastated. So the approval rate is quite good for the old member states. It's still supported. It's good. And it's even higher in countries that are having democratic problems. Poland loves the EU. Orban, Hungary, loves the EU. But they are basically always at odds with the EU, and they are Eurosceptic parties. As you see, both the candidate countries and the countries that are already a member, because just like there wasn't an exit clause, there's no firing clause, expulsion clause in the EU. So what are you going to do if a country which fulfilled the requirement to enter stops fulfilling the requirement? What if they are going to do communism the next day, or we are going to have an authoritarian regime officially? What's going to happen? And the final note is that you're going to talk about populism. It's worrying. From both the left and the right, all they want to be angry about is not just the global economy, but also they're angry about the EU, and their success is increasing. So there's that. All right, so I think I kind of talked a lot. You were so eager to listen. Sorry, I kind of probably talked a lot, as usual. It's been like that since 2017. I will want 2 hours.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was a lot of ground to cover. And I think, are there any questions? Anybody want to cover some ground? John? Here.
Thank you. Very enlightening. And I love your style of delivery.
Thank you.
I didn't hear any words made of education, commonalities, and the places where they aren't so common. Is this a real plus or a minus? Is the diversity over there a plus for education, or are they having difficulty with integration?
Great question. Actually, if you want to have a United States of Europe, you should start with education. And what the European Commission did early on is to actually have some funding for Erasmus exchange programs for university students, kind of getting stipends from the European Commission, from the EU budget, and then kind of exploring other cultures and become more melted, melting pot kind of thing. And the EU actually officially announced that there are 1 million Erasmus babies, because people actually meet in college during the exchange program. The father is Dutch, the mother is Italian, and they live in Denmark because there's single market, they can live anywhere. And they kind of talk 4 languages, 5 languages. That's something that the EU wanted. But other than that, we have the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence at Center for European Studies. They're trying to kind of promote the telling of the stories of the EU. My courses, for instance, EU, politics and institutions of the EU to teach. But other than that, they have some teachers training program, but they have to really start thinking, and also credit transfer things. But it's not essential. It's not about giving a uniform background. No one is having a goosebumps about the emergence of European coal and steel community. I do, because I'm that person who's interested in the EU, but no one is having goosebumps about that diplomatic meeting that they had and signed onto a treaty. they are having goosebumps about their national identity. They are growing with these stories, and it's very hard. It's a very important part. They're trying to harmonize, but it's an open method coordination thing. It's about naming and shaming. Like, if you're not part of it, you're kind of like, named and shamed, but they kind of like, try to kind of do this like, more voluntary basis. But there's no uniform education thing going on. It's just, if you want to talk about Europe, we are going to give you funds and you can talk about Europe and create European identity. But other than that, but most successful is Erasmus, 1 million babies.
One follow-up, is there any consistent teaching about the EU in the education in the various countries? I mean, like, is there sort of a common civics sort of a curriculum that they try to adhere to?
Yeah, on a voluntary basis, again, they are trying to incorporate that into the curriculum of like, especially like, primary school, high school kids. But as I said, like, it's voluntary basis, and the EU doesn't have that kind of like, power to impose anything else. And also when the national leaders are basically saying that we are in it because we just want the funds, but we don't like the liberal democracy requirement, there's nothing that you can actually like, do, because these teachers are also going to be the nationals of those countries and they're going to be affected by it. So, but it's EU is very much having a hard time in creating in preventing this content among the people about the EU and what it does. But I think the young generation is more interested in the EU's responsibilities to be increased because of the climate crisis that we are facing, and everyone agrees in the world that climate crisis is something that you have to deal at the, above the national levels, or gender rights, gender pay gap is something that is discussed in the EU, and they're trying to eradicate those differences as well. So in these, like, social issues, like, that everyone agrees that you have to, like, do it at the higher level, EU is stepping in. Because if you are going to have both paternal leave and maternal leave in Sweden, what about when you go to Italy, which is like the highest, like, in gender pay gap, or the, absence of leave, like, during pregnancy and so on. So if you have a single market, you also have to have those, like, things, standardized. So they're trying, but it really depends on their capacity to actually, like, benefit people and tell the people through education, like, what they're doing. It's very hard to tell to the people that there are 24 languages in 27 states that the EU has. How are you going to tell? It's very difficult.
Any other questions? Is there anything on Zoom, Julianne?
Yep, we have one. Richard, if fix your sound, whatever you did the other day with your sound. If we can't hear you, we can't hear you. Whatever you did the other day, Richard. Nope, not working. Sorry.
That's too bad. He can work on that.
Chat, maybe, no?
Just one question while Richard is working that out. Who is there a single leader who sort of the world identifies as the leader of the EU? I don't seem to see that.
Yeah, so we actually, like, this is kind of the perfect question, because it's the cleavage that we have between intergovernmentalism and supranationalism. Initially, the idea was that the European Commission president is going to be the political leader who's going to, like, get all these, like, 27 countries and will be the leader, like, the president of the United States, right? But it didn't work out, because early on with Charles de Gaulle kind of, like, clipping the wings of the European Commission president by saying, I'm not going to sit on the table, like, if you are going to impose your power on me, this kind of, like, and they realize that they cannot have that kind of person as the European Commission president. what they did is introducing Leaders Summit, who's chaired by another person. So Charles Michel right now is the European Council president, who is heading the summitry among the national leaders and gives some continuity to their negotiations. He kind of bargains with them, tries to negotiate, mediator. Charles Michel is kind of the head of state. And then there's the European Commission president, who is von der Leyen, and she is basically the head of government. And she's doing day-to-day business because European Council as a summit just gives general guidelines. They say, I don't want you to regulate olive oil bottles. I want you to just do important things. We don't want to you micromanage. And the Commission president gets that clue from them and then starts legislative initiatives based on that premise. So it's still the national leaders. And that's why I said German hegemony, because in the crisis, we actually seen it wasn't so much the European Commission president or the European Council president. We don't know who's going to be a more efficient leader in the future, but we have seen Merkel as the leader. Everyone was looking up to Merkel. And the fact that she said, if Europe fails, was the leader, and was making her the leader. Or when she says we owe these refugees a home, and when she kind of tried to calm down everyone who was angry about the incoming refugees, these are moral leadership. These are stepping in. I think it's always the national leader who is going to be the motor of this integration, not the Commission president or the European Council president.
So you're just hoping that there will be some strong leader in hopefully one of the strongest states to step forward. I have a question here.
Speaking of crisis, I see that Ukraine is on there, and of course that's a course coming up. However, how do you feel or conclude that the support of the EU is toward the Ukrainian situation? I mean, can you give us a...
Yeah, I think the EU failed Ukraine earlier. They're now doing what they haven't done before. So I think they're doing it in the wrong way. It's the similar case with the refugee crisis. They're always looking at the shores and looking at these dead babies on the shore who showed up. But they already had a moment back in Syria to actually stop it. And with the Ukraine, Putin was testing the waters well before with the Crimean annexation, with the Donbas region and so on. And the EU sat on the table with Merkel and Sarkozy at that time, and Medvedev. They sat on the table and then they said, yeah, maybe we should kind of give democratic rights to the Donbas region, to Russian-speaking people, these lofty democratic, things. And they said they actually made the peace preconditional on the enhancement of minority rights in Ukraine for Russian-speaking people. And basically, Putin is still living in this Western world and with the Western norms, and he's still trying to play by the book, make everything legitimate in the, even though not many people buy it, they still want to, he still wants to kind of say that, hey, there's a referendum in the Donbas region. 95% actually says they want to, have secession. So he still plays by the Western norms. And, but at the same time, it's kind of showing that he knew that the EU was kind of too lenient before. And that's why he thought that it was the right time to kind of enter. So EU is both the person who's causing this whole conflict and also kind of the sufferer because of it. But I think if the Ukrainians didn't fight, this staunch support would not come. I think it was Ukrainians who convinced them that, they could actually get involved without actually getting involved militarily by providing funds, because it's also a security issue. It's such a delicate issue. It's a security issue. They were going to fight with climate change already. It was in the budget. But Ukrainian crisis really made them think about solar panels and wind energy and all these things. So it's a very important thing, and they have to win this one.
Another question here.
Could you talk about Erdogan and Turkey from your unique position?
If Erdogan is ousted out in the next year's election in 2023, it's going to be the first country that actually, with elections, as an authoritarian leader like the one who wants to make the, Turkey more like, Saddam Hussein regime, or Iranian, regime, or the, Gaddafi regime, and so on. It's going to be the first country. And I believe that the democratic experiences that Turkey had, even though it's interrupted with short periods of military coups from time to time to protect secularism in Turkey, which is kind of an odd country in a way. It was an attempt to stop to protect secularism of the republic and the Turkish independence, and then military and intervening in democratic route that it's taking. But military itself was pro-Europe and pro-Western values, anti political Islam and so on, but they still stepped in, and it was the most important democratic problem. But right now, military has no power to do that, which is a good thing. So Erdogan kind of helped with that. But at the same time, the danger is that Erdogan has accepted 10 million refugees. They're not just refugees, because Turkey doesn't accept the people who are coming from the east as refugees. They're not party to the international treaty. They call those guests. Only refugees coming from the west are refugees in their books. And all these guests who are waiting to make money to go to Europe somehow illegally, and they haven't been integrated, because when Erdogan opened the doors, he thought that he was going to win in Syria and revive the Ottoman Empire, because he was pursuing this neo-Ottoman policy, where he was trying to build better relations with the former Ottoman territories and so on. But it kind of didn't work out the way that he wanted. And right now, Afghans are in Turkey, and also this Ukrainian war is creating food shortages and the fertilizer issues with regards to the energy and so on. Europe is going to face more immigrants, not just Ukrainians or Russians who are kind of currently fleeing draft in Russian military. They're going to actually have more North African, Middle Eastern refugees coming in. And the protests in Iran these days, it's going, there's a huge wave. This is kind of the peak moment in history. It hasn't been this way. The movement and the environmental migration that we are having because of the food shortages and the job, opportunities and so on. And you cannot actually make, and Turkey is the highest, is a country that actually holds the highest number of refugees in the world right now. You cannot have 10 new million without any kind of help or any kind of program to integrate them. It became a hub of everything, basically. You have all these different groups clashing. You don't know if Taliban is in there, if ISIS members are in there, if and Europe is basically allowing it to happen and just closing the borders and thinking that it's going to kind of stop being a problem. But it's also next door, right? Just like Yugoslavia was next door, and they kind of suffered in terms of international prestige when they couldn't help to stop all these atrocities that happened in Yugoslavia. They're also kind of creating like watching a condition happening in Turkey, but hopefully a democratic government is going to be elected next elections. Erdogan's approval rate is going down. Hopefully that will kind of like, help the country either do integration policies for the immigrants who came like early, or some kind of like have some peace with Assad, and so that they can actually peacefully send these like refugees back, and then all that. But we'll see. But Europe is actually like having this like issue next door.
It's not like we're out of crises. That's
Oh
for
no.
sure. No.
No, I have a semester-long class on that. That's why I talk a lot. I'm really sorry that I exceeded your time.
I think we will have to wrap it up here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And
I really wanted Richard's question, but
we'll,
yeah.
And next week, we'll be talking about the European response to COVID and how it had a scientific dimension that was rather unique, and also how the individual countries responded. So we'll see you next week. Thank you.